Look what is finally back. After 3 weeks of waiting that felt more like 3 months of waiting because I wasn't able to ride my dirt bike and it's just sitting there, my barrel is finally back from being redone. The outside looks cleaner than the rest of the engine now, which is going to be awkward, but more importantly, the inside of the barrel is looking better than ever before.
3 weeks ago, I embarked on my first ever top-end rebuild and found something that slowed the process down a lot. Nevertheless, I used that time to fix up other aspects of the bike, like the janky gear lever, and I also overhauled the drivetrain with new parts all around. And if one good thing came about getting the barrel redone, it's that the vapor blasting it went through even cleaned the splooge out of the hard to reach places, like in the power valve linkage cover.
If you remember when we tore the top end apart to do our quick top end rebuild, I found a chip on the edge of one of my exhaust ports, which needless to say really ruined my day and the next 3 weeks. But now that chip has been welded up and it's been recoated in that Nickel coating, so the whole thing just looks absolutely beautiful. You can see the cross hatching, and I'd love to just keep it here on the bench to look at every day. But I think it might be a bit more useful back on the bike. However, this is not what we have to do first. If you remember, that shift shaft has the mangled splines, so we first have to pull the old one out of that and put the new one in before we can start rebuilding the top end of the engine. But can we also just take a moment to appreciate that when I made the garage makeover video and built this shelving rack, all I had on it were 2 jerry cans because I didn't have enough things to fill it up. But yet it's coming in very handy right now for all the parts that have come off the bike and all the parts that are going to go onto the bike. Because off to the side we have the tank, seat and plastics. On the bottom we still have our jerry cans out of the way. On this level we've got bigger parts like carbs, silencers, pipes. Reeds aren't that big and covers aren't either, but they get to live on this level. The next one up, we've got all our little parts that came out of the engine that most of them are going to get to go back in there. Another level up, we've got all our new parts like a fresh air filter, all the gaskets we're going to need, a piston, some coolant, some engine oil or transmission oil, bearings, and then the old gear lever looking very sad. He's going to be happy to retire.
I started by draining the oil. Otherwise, things will get messy one way or another when we remove the engine cover and gear lever. It's a bit strange removing the clutch side engine cover to get out the gear lever that's on the opposite side, but it's actually a very straightforward job. So with the kickstart lever, brake lever, and coolant hose out of the way, I could remove the engine cover without even needing to remove the coolant pump or clutch covers. And I made sure to keep track of where the different length bolts go. For some reason, clutches are always fun to play with. I loosened off the springs and removed the pressure plate before loosening the clutch basket nut with my handy impact, which was one of the reasons I bought it in the first place. And it's actually the first time I've got to inspect this bike's clutch, and both the basket and plates were in better condition than I expected, which means one less thing to worry about at least. Then out came the inner hub and outer basket to reveal the back of the gear lever we've been looking for, which surprisingly just slides out, not even a single bolt.
Okay, so these are all the parts that we're going to need to replace the shift shaft. So obviously we have the shaft itself with its fresh splines. Everyone knows that you need a gear lever because the splines on that also got damaged. We've got this beautiful Tusk one that's black and blue anodized tip. I'm probably going to regret this when the anodizing wears off, but it's going to look pretty in the meantime. Sadly, I didn't get the matching brake lever, but maybe one day. In the meantime, it's going to be a bit lopsided. Then on the end of the shaft, there's always a seal to keep oil in and everything else out. So we've got a replacement of that just to be safe and while we're in there. And the same with the spring. So you might have noticed that your gear lever always returns to its natural position, and that's the spring's job. So we're going to replace that as well just to be safe. And then this green gasket didn't fare too well when you take it off, so we've got a replacement for that. It's even genuine Yamaha, way nicer than this green nonsense in my opinion.
And with both shafts on the bench, I found another reason to replace it. You can see the gap between the shafts growing and shrinking as I spin the old shaft, which means the tip is not just mangled, but also bent. I'm glad I decided to replace it. On the other side, the old seal just pops out, and then I use the back of a screwdriver and a hammer to seat the new one. That new shaft first needed plenty of lube, a spacer, that new spring we bought, and a washer before it could be slid into place, and the disassembly process could be reversed.
And I just broke my record for the cheapest part I've ever bought from Yamaha. If you're observant, you might have noticed that when I was taking the nut off the clutch basket, that the little tabs that you bend over on this lock washer were missing. That kind of worried me. And luckily, I don't think they broke off in the engine because there's no sign of them. I assume the last owner was just lazy and didn't bother replacing this because you are only supposed to use it once. I'm not gonna lie, I was gonna use it again, but luckily, Yamaha had a couple in stock.
With that problem now fixed, I moved on to the more nerve-wracking job of reassembling the top end. The cylinder needed to be stripped to be redone, so the first thing I had to do was reinstall the head studs. I struggled to remove them, but by this point I had the technique down, sandwiching two nuts together and using the top nut to tighten the studs down. Next, the power valve could be reassembled, and that new shaft and new seal put in that hopefully means the end of splooge pouring out the side of my engine.
And then over here, I even have a laptop with my service manual on, so that if I need any diagrams or layouts, any torque specs, because a mate of mine even lent me a torque wrench so that we can do things properly, we have all the information we could possibly need.
I'm pretty sure I went overboard with the premix, but better to have too much than too little. And since I had a complete gasket set, everything got a fresh gasket or O-ring. And by this point, I even had a pretty good understanding of how the exhaust valve works. I'm going to upset a few Germans with my pronunciation, but I opted for a Wasner piston kit because I found plenty of good things about them online, like their coating. And the cylinder was matched to this piston, hence the job number on the top of it, which I did clean off with a bit of petrol before installation. To check that the ring end gap was in spec, the cylinder needs to be coated with some premix, and then the ring is put into the cylinder, squared off with the piston, and then the gap can be measured with a feeler gauge, which to my relief were both in spec, because I didn't fancy filing them down. I'm warning you now that there's never any footage of me actually getting a circlip seated in the piston because it's such a fiddly job that I eventually just ditched the camera. But with one side in, the rings could now go on and be positioned in the right orientation. The new small end bearing got lubed up as well as placed in the conrod, followed by the piston going on and the gudgeon pin being slid through, with more missing footage of circlip installation. Compressing the rings with one hand while making sure they're in the right orientation and sliding the cylinder on with the other hand was actually easier than I expected and rather satisfying to watch. However, not as satisfying as testing to see if the piston moves up and down smoothly. That I could watch for hours. I mopped up the excess premix on the piston before greasing up some O-rings to keep them in their grooves while I put the head back on. and tightened it all up in a star pattern. The little things like reed cage, coolant hose, carburetor and engine mount were then easy and stress-free to install compared to the internal stuff that I'd never done before today. Finally, it then got a fresh spark plug, some new coolant, fresh transmission oil, a new air filter, and even a new kind of air filter oil, since I've been using the spray-on oil and I don't think it's as good as the real thing. And outside it went for its big moment.
You can tell I'm somewhat ambitious about it actually starting because I've half kitted up, so that on the off chance, well, we're gonna be positive, when it does fire up, I can actually get on it, go for a quick ride and get it up to temperature so that we can do its first heat cycle. I'm not gonna do a very serious break-in, just do about 3 heat cycles, try and run it in fairly gently, but still varying revs. But it's not gonna be too scientific. So a part of me is really excited because I get my bike back. A part of me is terrified on the off chance that it actually blows up because after all I did the work on it. And a part of me is actually disappointed and sad because I really am gonna miss having a project bike. I've learnt a lot and this has been so much fun. And I might just be procrastinating because I'm nervous now. Okay, here goes nothing. Fuel on. And I have cranked it over with my hand. I thought it had compression before this, but now it really does. I think I tightened all the bolts.
Minutes later.
Okay, first of all, I completely forgot how much fun dirt bikes actually are. Why didn't anybody tell me? And secondly, it runs absolutely beautifully. I'm so relieved that it started up on just the second kick because a part of me really thought it would never run again. I couldn't tell you if it makes more power or not because I wasn't pushing it hard, obviously, on its first ride. Still trying to break it in a little bit, but we'll do another few heat cycles and get it to a track ASAP. I'm chuffed with that.
But anyway, I got it to the track just 2 days later and got to feel if the engine was any more powerful. So subscribe to my second channel so you don't miss that. And this is not the last massive upgrade I've got planned for the YZ. In fact, the box with the coolest upgrade it could possibly get is already sitting on my desk. But ultimately, it feels like a new bike in terms of shifting, with its new gear lever parts and chain and sprockets, which is exactly what I wanted. It's confidence inspiring to know more about my engine's health and how it works, and this has made me want to dig into the bottom end to learn more about that. Just not on this bike, because now I want to ride it.